The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned warehouse district as Captain Elena Vasquez crouched behind a concrete barrier, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. 3 months had passed since the Phantom Battalion had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only whispers and empty barracks. The military brass had declared them all killed in action, but Elena knew better. She had been tracking unusual movements in the sector for weeks, following a trail that led to this forgotten corner of the city. Her rifle rested steady against her shoulder as she adjusted the scope with practiced precision. The weapon was a custom piece modified over years of service in special operations. Each adjustment was deliberate, calculated as she prepared for what might be her only chance to confirm what everyone else refused to believe. The Phantom Battalion was still out there, operating in the shadows, but their mission had changed in ways no one could have predicted. Through her scope, Elena watched a figure emerge from the warehouse entrance. Tall and lean, moving with the distinctive gait of military training, the person wore civilian clothes but carried themselves like a soldier. Something metallic caught the light as they raised their hand to shield their eyes from the morning glare. Elena held her breath and fine-tuned her scope's focus, bringing the distant figure into crystal clarity. The tattoo was unmistakable. Etched across the back of the hand in bold black ink was the distinctive insignia of the Phantom Battalion, a ghostly skull surrounded by crossed rifles and the unit's motto in Latin script. Elena had seen that same mark on dozens of soldiers during her time at the forward operating base. She knew every line, every curve of that design, and there was no mistaking what she was seeing now. Major David Chen had been reported killed in action during the battalion's final mission 6 months ago. Elena had attended his memorial service, had watched his wife receive the folded flag. Yet here he was, very much alive, walking freely through a supposedly abandoned section of the city. The implication sent a chill down her spine that had nothing to do with the morning cold. Elena's mind raced as she maintained her surveillance. If Chen was alive, how many others from the Phantom Battalion had survived? Why had they been declared dead? More importantly, what were they doing now, operating without official sanction or oversight? The questions multiplied faster than she could process them, each one more troubling than the last. The major paused at the warehouse entrance, his head turning slowly as if scanning for threats. His movements were cautious, professional, suggesting he was still following military protocols despite his apparent civilian status. Elena adjusted her position slightly, ensuring she remained hidden while maintaining her line of sight. Years of training had taught her patience, and she would wait as long as necessary to gather the intelligence she needed. 2 more figures emerged from the warehouse, both carrying themselves with the same unmistakable military bearing. Elena recognized neither of them, but both wore long sleeves that could easily conceal similar tattoos. The 3 men engaged in what appeared to be a brief tactical discussion, their body language suggesting they were coordinating some kind of operation. After a few minutes, they separated, each heading in a different direction through the maze of abandoned buildings. Elena made a split-second decision. She secured her rifle and began moving through the shadows, following the major at a distance that would keep her undetected while allowing her to observe his activities. Her years of reconnaissance training served her well as she navigated through the urban terrain, using abandoned vehicles and debris to mask her movement. The major seemed to know exactly where he was going. Following a route that suggested familiarity with the area, the chase led through narrow alleys and forgotten streets until the major entered what appeared to be another abandoned building. Elena positioned herself across the street, using her scope to observe the windows for any sign of activity. What she saw made her blood run cold. Through a partially boarded window, she could make out at least a dozen figures moving about inside. All of them moved with military precision, and several bore visible tattoos that matched the Phantom Battalion insignia. Elena realized she had stumbled upon something far larger than a few survivors operating independently. This was an organized group, possibly the entire surviving membership of the Phantom Battalion operating as a rogue unit. The questions that had been troubling her earlier now seemed almost insignificant compared to the magnitude of what she was witnessing. An entire military unit officially declared dead was conducting operations on domestic soil without authorization. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, Elena maintained her position, documenting everything she observed. She counted faces, noted equipment, and began mapping what appeared to be a sophisticated operation. The abandoned building was clearly being used as some kind of command center, with individuals coming and going at regular intervals. Whatever the Phantom Battalion was planning, it was big enough to require significant coordination and resources. The weight of her discovery settled on Elena's shoulders like a physical burden. She held information that could shake the military establishment to its core, evidence that challenged everything the public had been told about one of the most elite units in the armed forces. But with that knowledge came danger. If the Phantom Battalion had gone rogue, there was no telling how far they would go to protect their secret. Elena knew she was walking into a situation where the wrong move could prove fatal. Elena spent the next 2 days conducting surveillance from different positions around the abandoned district. Each observation post revealed more pieces of the puzzle, but none of them made the complete picture any clearer. The Phantom Battalion members moved with purpose, following schedules and protocols that suggested they were still operating under some form of command structure. But whose orders were they following, and what was their ultimate objective? On the third morning, Elena decided to take a calculated risk. She needed to get closer, to hear what the battalion members were discussing and understand the nature of their operations. Using her knowledge of urban reconnaissance, she identified a drainage tunnel that ran beneath the building they were using as headquarters. The tunnel system had been part of the old industrial infrastructure, abandoned when the factories closed down decades earlier. The journey through the tunnels was treacherous. Elena crawled through narrow passages filled with stagnant water and debris, her equipment carefully sealed in waterproof containers. The darkness was complete, forcing her to rely on a small infrared light that would be invisible to anyone above ground. Every sound seemed amplified in the confined space, and she had to pause frequently to listen for any indication that her presence had been detected. After what felt like hours, Elena reached a section of tunnel that passed directly beneath the target building. Through gaps in the deteriorating concrete above, she could hear voices. Moving carefully to avoid making noise, she positioned herself where the acoustic properties of the tunnel would allow her to pick up conversations from the room above. What she heard confirmed her worst fears. Major Chen's voice was unmistakable as he briefed his team on what he called Phase 2 of their operation. They were discussing government buildings, security protocols, and timing that suggested they were planning some kind of coordinated strike. The fragments of conversation Elena could make out painted a picture of a group that had gone far beyond simple desertion. They were actively planning operations against their own government. The most chilling moment came when she heard Chen mention civilian casualties as an acceptable variable in their planning. Elena had served alongside many of these men, had trusted them with her life during joint operations. To hear them discuss innocent lives so callously was a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. The Phantom Battalion had become something monstrous, transformed from protectors into potential terrorists. Elena spent another hour in the tunnel, recording everything she could hear on a small digital device. The intelligence she was gathering would be crucial for any response to the threat the rogue battalion posed. But as she prepared to extract from her hiding place, disaster struck. A section of the aging tunnel ceiling gave way, sending chunks of concrete crashing down into the water below. The noise echoed through the tunnels like gunshots. Elena knew immediately that her presence had been compromised. Above her, the voices stopped abruptly, replaced by the sounds of rapid movement and shouted commands. She had seconds before they would be searching the area systematically. Every instinct told her to run, but Elena forced herself to think tactically. Panic would only ensure her capture or death. Elena began moving through the tunnel as quickly as silence would allow. Behind her, she could hear the battalion members organizing a search. Flashlight beams began probing through the gaps in the floor above, sending shafts of light dancing across the tunnel walls. She pressed herself against the concrete, trying to become invisible while continuing to move toward what she hoped was an exit. The tunnel system was more complex than Elena had anticipated, with multiple branches and dead ends that threatened to trap her in a maze beneath the city. She relied on her compass and her memory of the building layout above to navigate, but the pressure of pursuit made every decision feel like a potential mistake. The sounds of the search were getting closer, and she could hear what sounded like multiple teams working their way through different sections of the tunnel. Elena's luck ran out when she reached a section where the tunnel narrowed considerably. As she squeezed through the tight passage, her equipment bag caught on a piece of protruding rebar. The metallic scraping sound might as well have been a fire alarm. Within seconds, she could hear footsteps splashing through the water behind her, moving in her direction with the systematic precision she remembered from her day's training with Special Forces units. Rather than continue fleeing blindly, Elena made another tactical decision. She found a section where a side tunnel branched off from the main passage and positioned herself in the shadows just inside the entrance. When the 1st Battalion member rounded the corner, Elena was ready. Years of hand-to-hand combat training served her well as she neutralized the threat quietly and efficiently. But Elena knew that eliminating one pursuer would only buy her minutes at most. She stripped the unconscious soldier of his radio and weapon, hoping to monitor their communications and gain some advantage in the deadly game of cat and mouse playing out in the tunnels beneath the city. The radio chatter confirmed what she already knew. They were conducting a thorough sweep, and her window for escape was closing rapidly. Using the stolen radio, Elena was able to track the movement of the search teams and identify a section of tunnel that seemed to be unguarded. She made her way carefully through the darkness, her newly acquired weapon ready for immediate use. The exit she eventually found led to a storm drain that opened into an alley several blocks from the original building. As she emerged into daylight, Elena realized that her reconnaissance mission had become something much more dangerous. She was now a target, hunted by the very people she had once called comrades. Elena emerged from the storm drain covered in grime and fully aware that her life had changed forever. The recording device in her waterproof container held evidence that could prevent a catastrophic attack. But getting that information to the right people would require navigating a minefield of military bureaucracy and potential corruption. She couldn't be sure how deep the conspiracy went or who could be trusted with such explosive intelligence. Her first instinct was to contact her commanding officer, but Elena hesitated. The Phantom Battalion had been declared dead by the highest levels of military leadership. Either there had been a massive intelligence failure, or someone in authority was actively covering up the truth. Until she could determine which scenario was correct, Elena would have to operate alone, trusting no one within the official chain of command. Elena made her way through the city using tradecraft she had learned during covert operations training. She varied her routes, used reflections in windows and mirrors to check for surveillance, and changed her appearance as much as possible without access to professional disguise materials. The weight of the stolen radio and weapon reminded her constantly that she was now operating outside legal boundaries, but the alternative was allowing a terrorist attack to proceed unchallenged. She rented a room in a cheap hotel on the outskirts of the city, paying cash and using identification documents she had acquired during previous undercover assignments. The room was small and dirty, but it offered the privacy she needed to review the intelligence she had gathered and plan her next move. Elena spread maps across the bed and began analyzing the fragments of conversation she had recorded in the tunnel. The picture that emerged was terrifying. The Phantom Battalion was planning simultaneous strikes against multiple government facilities during a major political event scheduled for the following week. The attack would be coordinated to maximize both casualties and psychological impact, designed to shake public confidence in the government's ability to maintain security. Elena realized she was looking at evidence of a domestic terrorism plot that would make previous attacks seem minor by comparison. What troubled Elena most was the level of inside knowledge the battalion clearly possessed. They had detailed information about security protocols, shift changes, and vulnerabilities that could only have come from current intelligence sources. Someone within the government or military establishment was feeding them information, making the conspiracy far more extensive than she had initially imagined. Elena spent hours transcribing and analyzing the recorded conversations, looking for any clue that might reveal the identity of the battalion's contacts within the system. Names were mentioned in code, but she began to see patterns that suggested the involvement of multiple agencies and departments. The scope of the betrayal was staggering, involving people who had sworn oaths to protect the very institutions they were now preparing to attack. As night fell, Elena realized she couldn't delay action any longer. Every hour that passed brought the planned attack closer to execution. She needed to find someone in authority who could be trusted with the intelligence, someone with both the power to act and the integrity to do so regardless of political consequences. The problem was identifying such a person without revealing her own involvement prematurely. Elena remembered Colonel Sarah Morrison, a woman who had built a reputation for absolute honesty during her rise through the ranks. Morrison commanded respect across service branches and had never been associated with political maneuvering or personal advancement at the expense of duty. More importantly, she had no connection to the units or operations that might be compromised by the conspiracy Elena had uncovered. Making contact with Colonel Morrison would require careful planning. Elena couldn't simply walk into a military installation and request a meeting without triggering security protocols that might alert the wrong people to her activities. She needed to find a way to reach Morrison privately, away from official channels that might be monitored by conspirators within the system. Elena spent the next morning conducting surveillance of Morrison's known routines and schedule. The colonel maintained a disciplined lifestyle, following patterns that made her movements somewhat predictable. Each Tuesday evening, Morrison visited a small coffee shop near her home, usually spending about an hour reading and responding to personal correspondence. The location would provide the privacy Elena needed, while offering multiple escape routes if the meeting went wrong. On Tuesday evening, Elena positioned herself in the coffee shop before Morrison's usual arrival time. She had changed her appearance as much as possible, wearing civilian clothes and a baseball cap that partially concealed her features. When Morrison entered the shop and took her customary table, Elena waited several minutes before approaching, wanting to ensure they wouldn't be interrupted or observed by potential surveillance. The conversation that followed would determine not only Elena's fate, but potentially the security of the entire nation. Morrison listened without interruption, as Elena presented her credentials and explained the circumstances that had led to her discovery of the rogue battalion. The colonel's expression grew increasingly grave as Elena described the intelligence she had gathered and the nature of the threat they were facing. Morrison's response was exactly what Elena had hoped for. The colonel didn't question Elena's methods or express concern about the legal implications of her unauthorized surveillance. Instead, she focused immediately on the threat assessment and the actions required to prevent the planned attack. Morrison had the authority to mobilize resources and coordinate with other agencies, but she would need concrete evidence to convince skeptical superiors. Elena handed over copies of the recordings and her analysis of the intelligence, keeping the originals as insurance against potential retaliation. Morrison reviewed the materials quickly but thoroughly, her military training evident in the way she processed and evaluated the information. When she finished, the colonel looked up with an expression that mixed admiration with concern. Morrison explained that acting on Elena's intelligence would require carefully orchestrated coordination between multiple agencies, all while maintaining operational security to prevent the conspirators from learning about the investigation. The colonel promised to begin the process immediately, but warned Elena that she would need to remain hidden until the threat was neutralized. Too many people now knew about her involvement, and her life was undoubtedly in danger from multiple sources. Elena spent the next 48 hours in a different safe house, this one provided by Colonel Morrison through channels that bypassed normal military protocols. The waiting was agony, knowing that every minute brought the planned attack closer while she remained powerless to take direct action. Morrison had promised to maintain contact, but operational security meant that communication would be minimal until the threat was resolved. On Thursday morning, Elena's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Morrison. The intelligence had been verified through independent sources, and a joint task force was being assembled to address the threat. However, the investigation had revealed that the conspiracy reached higher into the military hierarchy than anyone had anticipated. 3 generals and dozens of field officers were potentially involved, making any coordinated response extremely dangerous. The message also contained disturbing news about Elena's former teammate who had been captured in the tunnels. Under interrogation, he had revealed Elena's identity to the Phantom Battalion leadership. Major Chen now knew exactly who was responsible for exposing their operation, and he had already dispatched teams to locate and eliminate her. Morrison warned that Elena should assume she was being actively hunted by professionals who knew her methods and capabilities. Elena's training kicked in as she processed this information. She immediately began implementing counter-surveillance protocols, varying her routines and changing her appearance more dramatically. The safe house was no longer safe, so she gathered her essential equipment and prepared to go mobile. Staying ahead of trained hunters would require constant movement and maximum vigilance. As Elena prepared to leave the safe house, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A small piece of tape she had placed across the doorframe as a security measure had been disturbed. Someone had entered the building during the night, which meant her location had been compromised. Elena drew her weapon and moved carefully through the rooms, checking for signs of intrusion or surveillance devices. In the bathroom, Elena found evidence that confirmed her worst fears. A tiny electronic device had been placed behind the mirror, barely visible but sophisticated enough to transmit both audio and video. The Phantom Battalion had not only found her hideout, but had been monitoring her activities for an unknown period. Elena realized she was walking into a trap, but leaving might trigger an immediate response from watchers positioned around the building. Elena made a rapid tactical assessment of her situation. The surveillance device suggested that her hunters were planning to take her alive, probably for interrogation about what she had learned and who she had contacted. This gave her a small advantage, as they would likely try to capture rather than kill her immediately. Elena began planning her escape, looking for ways to use their expectations against them. Moving to a window that faced an alley, Elena could see at least 2 individuals positioned to observe the building's exits. Their locations and equipment suggested military training, confirming that the Phantom Battalion was conducting the operation personally rather than using local assets. Elena counted at least 4 potential hostiles, but there were probably more positioned where she couldn't see them. Elena decided to create a diversion that would draw some of the watchers away from their positions. She rigged an improvised explosive device using cleaning supplies from the safe house, timing it to detonate in a room on the opposite side of the building from her planned escape route. The explosion would create chaos and possibly convince her hunters that she had been killed in a desperate attempt to avoid capture. The plan worked better than Elena had hoped. When the improvised bomb detonated, she could hear shouting and rapid movement from the positions where she had spotted surveillance personnel. Elena waited 60 seconds for the confusion to peak, then made her move through a basement window that led directly into the building's utility tunnels. The route was one she had scouted during her first night in the safe house, preparing for exactly this type of emergency escape. Elena moved through the utility systems beneath the city, using maintenance tunnels and subway infrastructure to travel several miles, before emerging in a completely different district. The journey took nearly 3 hours, but it allowed her to break contact with her pursuers and establish a new operational area. Elena knew they would eventually realize she had escaped, but the delay would give her time to plan her next moves. Finding a new hiding place became Elena's immediate priority. She couldn't rely on official channels or known assets, as the conspiracy might extend to people who had access to safe house locations and operational protocols. Elena would have to depend on resources and contacts from her life before military service, people who had no connection to the current crisis. Elena remembered Maria Santos, a college roommate who had become a successful lawyer specializing in civil rights cases. Maria lived in a secure apartment building with excellent security systems, and her work often involved protecting people from government persecution. More importantly, Maria had no military connections that might compromise Elena's safety. Making contact with Maria required careful planning. Elena couldn't simply show up at her friend's apartment without explanation, but she also couldn't risk detailed communication through channels that might be monitored. Elena decided to use a code phrase from their college days, something that would identify her to Maria, while remaining meaningless to anyone else who might intercept the message. Maria's response came within hours, providing an address for a meeting location that wasn't connected to her home or office. When they met that evening, Elena could see the concern in her friend's eyes as she explained the basics of her situation without revealing classified details. Maria asked few questions, but offered Elena shelter in a property she owned that wasn't connected to her public identity. The new hideout was a small apartment in an older building that Maria had purchased as an investment property. Elena would have complete privacy and security, while remaining within reach of the city center where the planned attack was supposed to take place. Maria also provided Elena with new identification documents and a vehicle that couldn't be traced back to her own activities. As Elena settled into her new sanctuary, she received another encrypted message from Colonel Morrison. The task force had made significant progress in identifying the conspirators, but they had also discovered that the planned attack was scheduled for the next day, much earlier than originally believed. Elena realized that time had run out for a careful, methodical response to the threat. Whatever action would be taken would have to happen within the next few hours, and she might be the only person in position to prevent a catastrophe. Elena's phone buzzed again at 3 a.m. with an emergency communication from Colonel Morrison. The message was brief but terrifying. The task force had been compromised. Several key personnel had been arrested on fabricated charges, and the planned attack was now less than 12 hours away. Morrison herself was in hiding, unable to coordinate any official response to the threat. Elena was effectively the only person in position to prevent what could be the deadliest domestic terrorist attack in the nation's history. The weight of responsibility settled on Elena's shoulders like a physical burden. She had never operated completely alone on a mission of this magnitude, but there was no choice. The Phantom Battalion had outmaneuvered the official response, using their inside knowledge and connections to neutralize the threat before it could develop. Elena would have to rely entirely on her own skills and resources to stop them. Morrison's final message contained intelligence that changed everything Elena thought she knew about the planned attack. The primary target wasn't a government building or military installation. Instead, the Phantom Battalion was planning to strike during the National Memorial Day ceremony, where thousands of civilians would be gathered to honor fallen soldiers. The irony was sickening. Rogue military personnel planning to murder innocent people at an event dedicated to honoring military sacrifice. Elena studied maps of the memorial site, identifying potential attack vectors and defensive positions. The location was a nightmare from a security perspective, with multiple approaches and thousands of people spread across an area that was impossible to secure completely. The Phantom Battalion had chosen their target expertly, selecting a location where maximum casualties would be inevitable, even with advance warning. The ceremony was scheduled to begin at 10 a.m., with the president and other high-ranking officials scheduled to arrive at 9:30. Elena calculated that the attack would probably be timed to coincide with the moment of greatest symbolic impact, likely during the playing of the national anthem or the moment of silence for fallen soldiers. The psychological damage would be as devastating as the physical casualties. Elena realized she needed more current intelligence about the battalion's specific plans and positioning. The recordings she had made days earlier provided general information about timing and targets, but tactical details would be necessary to mount any effective counter-operation. She would have to conduct reconnaissance of the memorial site while avoiding both the official security presence and the Phantom Battalion operatives who would already be in position. Moving through the pre-dawn darkness, Elena approached the memorial area using routes that avoided main thoroughfares and security checkpoints. Her military training in urban reconnaissance served her well as she identified observation positions that would allow her to monitor the site without being detected. The challenge was distinguishing between legitimate security personnel and potential attackers in an environment where everyone would be armed and suspicious. Elena positioned herself in an abandoned office building that overlooked the memorial plaza. Using high-powered optics, she began methodically scanning the area for anything that seemed inconsistent with normal security preparations. What she discovered confirmed her worst fears. The Phantom Battalion had already infiltrated the security perimeter, positioning themselves as part of the official protection detail. Through her scope, Elena could identify at least 6 individuals bearing the distinctive tattoos of the Phantom Battalion. They were dressed as security personnel and positioned at key points around the memorial site, but their locations were tactically perfect for a coordinated assault rather than protective coverage. Elena realized that the attack would come from within the security cordon, making it nearly impossible for official responders to distinguish between legitimate and hostile forces. Elena spent the next 2 hours mapping the positions of known battalion members and trying to identify their likely plan of attack. The pattern that emerged was sophisticated and deadly. The rogue soldiers had positioned themselves to create overlapping fields of fire that would turn the Memorial Plaza into a kill zone. When the attack began, escape would be virtually impossible for anyone caught in the open area. As the sun rose and preparation for the ceremony intensified, Elena faced the most difficult decision of her life. She could contact authorities and hope that someone would believe her warning in time to prevent the attack. But the conspiracy within the system made that option extremely risky. Alternatively, she could attempt to stop the attack herself. But doing so would require engaging multiple trained soldiers while, surrounded by innocent civilians. Elena made her choice based on the simple calculation that action offered the only realistic chance of preventing mass casualties. She gathered her equipment and began moving toward the memorial site, using her knowledge of the battalion's positions to plan an approach that would give her the best chance of success. The odds were heavily against her, but Elena had been in similar situations before and survived through preparation and determination. Her plan was necessarily simple given the constraints of time and resources. Elena would position herself to engage the battalion members in sequence, using surprise and superior positioning to overcome their numerical advantage. The key would be preventing them from coordinating their response and drawing them away from the civilian population before they could implement their attack. Planned Elena's first target was a sniper positioned on a rooftop overlooking the main speaking platform. The soldier was dressed as a federal security agent, but his position and equipment were wrong for protective duties. Elena approached through the building's maintenance access, using her knowledge of urban warfare tactics to reach the roof without detection. The engagement was quick and silent, neutralizing the threat before moving to her next objective. The second target proved more challenging. Major Chen himself was positioned near the main entrance to the Memorial Plaza, dressed as a senior security coordinator. Elena realized that eliminating Chen would likely trigger an immediate response from the other battalion members, potentially causing them to execute their attack prematurely. She would have to time her action perfectly to prevent the maximum number of casualties. Elena positioned herself where she could observe Chen while monitoring the approaches used by arriving dignitaries and civilians. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in less than an hour, and the plaza was already filling with people who had no idea they were walking into a carefully prepared ambush. Elena checked her weapons one final time, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether hundreds of innocent people lived or died. The moment had come to discover whether one person could truly make a difference against overwhelming odds. Elena watched through her scope as Major Chen raised his hand to his earpiece, clearly communicating with other members of the Phantom Battalion positioned around the memorial site. The ceremony had begun, with hundreds of families gathering to honor their fallen loved ones, completely unaware of the danger surrounding them. Elena knew that Chen's signal would likely trigger the coordinated attack within minutes. Taking a deep breath, Elena made her decision. She couldn't wait for the perfect moment. Innocent lives were at stake, and delay would only increase the casualty count. Elena lined up her shot on Chen, but at the crucial moment, a group of children ran between her position and her target, forcing her to hold fire. Those precious seconds allowed Chen to spot the glint of her scope and dive for cover behind a concrete barrier. Chen's sudden movement triggered exactly the response Elena had hoped to avoid. The other battalion members, thinking their leader was under attack, began moving toward predetermined positions for their assault. Elena could see the pattern developing as armed figures in security uniforms started converging on the main crowd of civilians. She had seconds to act before the massacre began. Elena shifted her aim to the next closest battalion member, a man positioned on an elevated platform overlooking the memorial wall, where families were placing flowers. Her shot was clean and effective, but the sound of gunfire sent panic through the crowd. Screaming civilians began running in all directions, creating chaos that would make it even harder for Elena to identify and eliminate the remaining threats. The advantage of surprise was gone, but the confusion worked both ways. The remaining battalion members were having difficulty coordinating their attack plan, as panicked civilians fled between them and their intended targets. Elena used the chaos to change positions, moving to a new vantage point that would give her a better angle on Chen's hiding place behind the concrete barrier. From her new position, Elena could see that Chen was trying to restore communication with his scattered team while avoiding her line of fire. She could also see that several legitimate security personnel were now responding to the gunfire, but they had no way to distinguish between Elena and the battalion members. Elena realized she was about to become a target for both hostile and friendly forces. Elena's next shot was aimed at a battalion member who was trying to use the crowd's panic to get closer to the main speaking platform where government officials were being evacuated. The round found its target, but Elena's muzzle flash revealed her position to Chen, who immediately began directing coordinated fire in her direction. Bullets struck the concrete around Elena's position, forcing her to seek better cover. As Elena moved to a new firing position, she could hear Chen shouting orders to his remaining men. The original attack plan was clearly falling apart, but Chen was adapting, trying to salvage the operation by focusing on the high-value targets who were still exposed during the evacuation process. Elena realized that even a partial success for the battalion would achieve their goal of creating terror and undermining confidence in government security. Elena's fourth shot eliminated another battalion member who was advancing on a group of elderly veterans who had fallen during the initial panic and couldn't move quickly to safety. The man had been raising his weapon to fire into the helpless group when Elena's bullet found him. Each successful engagement was reducing the threat, but Elena was also drawing increasing fire from the survivors. The situation became even more complex when Elena heard sirens approaching from multiple directions. Emergency responders were arriving, but they would be entering a situation where identification of friendlies and hostiles would be nearly impossible. Elena knew that her window for action was closing rapidly. Soon there would be too many people in the area for her to operate effectively without risking civilian casualties. Elena spotted Chen making a run for a new position that would give him a clear shot at the evacuation route being used by government officials. She tracked him through her scope, but her shot was blocked by a memorial statue. Elena had to move again, using the monument itself as cover while trying to get a clear angle on her primary target. The chase was becoming a deadly game of tactical positioning. From her new location behind the memorial statue, Elena could see that 3 battalion members were still active, including Chen. They had abandoned their original coordinated attack plan and were now operating independently, each trying to inflict maximum casualties before being eliminated. Elena realized that stopping them would require perfect timing and accuracy under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Elena's 5th shot caught a battalion member who was firing into a crowd of fleeing civilians. The man had taken position behind an overturned vendor cart and was shooting systematically at anyone who moved across his field of vision. Elena's bullet ended his rampage, but the sound of her rifle also revealed her location to Chen, who immediately began moving to flank her position. Realizing that Chen was trying to get behind her, Elena made another tactical movement, this time heading directly toward the memorial wall where the heaviest concentration of civilians were taking shelter. It was a risky move that would put her closer to potential crossfire, but Elena calculated that Chen wouldn't risk hitting innocent people if she could position herself correctly among the crowd. Elena's gamble paid off initially, as her position among the terrified families made it difficult for Chen to engage her without risking civilian casualties. But Elena also realized that she had limited her own ability to maneuver and fire effectively. The tactical situation had become a stalemate, with both Elena and the remaining battalion members constrained by the presence of innocent bystanders. The stalemate was broken when Elena heard Chen's voice calling out to her across the memorial plaza. He was offering to negotiate, proposing that she surrender herself in exchange for allowing the remaining civilians to evacuate safely. Elena knew it was a trap, but she also recognized that the current situation couldn't continue indefinitely without more people being killed. Something had to change, and Elena was the only person in position to make it happen. Elena listened to Chen's offer while calculating her remaining options. She could hear the desperation in his voice, suggesting that the attack had failed so completely that he was willing to negotiate rather than continue fighting. But Elena also knew that trusting a man who had planned to massacre innocent civilians would be the last mistake she ever made. Chen's proposal was likely a trap designed to get her into the open, where she could be eliminated easily. Instead of responding to Chen's call, Elena began moving carefully through the crowd of terrified civilians, using their panic and confusion to mask her movement. She needed to get close enough to Chen to engage him effectively, while avoiding the crossfire from his remaining team members. The memorial wall provided some concealment, but Elena would eventually have to expose herself to complete her mission. Elena spotted Chen positioned behind a memorial fountain, using the stone structure as both cover and a vantage point to observe the evacuation routes. His tactical position was excellent, but Elena noticed that his attention was focused on the areas where he expected her to appear in response to his negotiation offer. She decided to approach from an angle he wouldn't anticipate, even if it meant taking a longer and more dangerous route. Moving low and using the memorial plaques and flower arrangements for concealment, Elena worked her way around the perimeter of Chen's position. The approach took nearly 10 minutes, during which she could hear police and emergency responders setting up a perimeter around the memorial site. Elena knew that time was running out. Soon the area would be flooded with law enforcement personnel who wouldn't be able to distinguish her from the remaining battalion members. Elena's patience was rewarded when she finally achieved a position where she could observe Chen without being detected. The major was clearly growing frustrated with her failure to respond to his offer, and Elena could see him making increasingly aggressive gestures to his remaining team members. Chen was preparing to abandon the negotiation and resume the attack, probably reasoning that he had nothing left to lose. From her concealed position, Elena could also see the last two battalion members who were still active. One was positioned near the memorial's main entrance, apparently trying to prevent civilian evacuation, while the other had taken cover behind a maintenance building and was firing sporadically at police positions. Elena realized that eliminating Chen might cause the other two to surrender, or it might trigger a final desperate assault. Elena made her decision based on years of combat experience and tactical training. Chen was clearly the leader and coordinator of the remaining opposition. Removing him would disrupt whatever plan the survivors were trying to implement, even if it didn't end the threat completely. Elena lined up her shot carefully, accounting for wind and distance while ensuring that her bullet wouldn't endanger any of the civilians still trapped in the area. The shot was perfect. Chen dropped immediately, his weapon clattering across the stone plaza as Elena's bullet found its mark. The psychological impact on his remaining team members was immediate and dramatic. Elena could see both survivors looking around frantically, trying to locate the source of the shot while dealing with the reality that their leader was gone. One of the remaining battalion members immediately threw down his weapon and raised his hands in surrender, apparently deciding that continuing the fight was pointless without Chen's leadership. The man began walking slowly toward the police perimeter with his hands clearly visible, shouting that he was giving up. Elena kept him in her sights until police officers secured him, ensuring that his surrender wasn't an elaborate deception. The final battalion member proved more stubborn. Instead of surrendering, he began firing wildly in all directions, apparently hoping to inflict casualties before being eliminated. Elena tracked him through her scope as he moved erratically between cover positions, but getting a clean shot was difficult because of his unpredictable movement pattern and the risk to nearby civilians. Elena's opportunity came when the desperate gunman paused to reload behind the maintenance building. She had a clear line of sight for approximately 3 seconds, just enough time to line up and execute her final shot of the engagement. The bullet ended the threat permanently, bringing the battle for the memorial site to a conclusion. As silence settled over the memorial plaza, Elena realized that the immediate danger was over, but her own situation remained precarious. Law enforcement personnel were systematically sweeping the area, and Elena was an armed individual in a location where multiple people had been killed. She needed to extract from the scene before being identified as a combatant, regardless of which side she had been fighting for. Elena secured her weapon and began moving toward an exit route she had identified during her initial reconnaissance of the area. The route would take her through a section of the memorial that was currently unmonitored by law enforcement, allowing her to escape before questions could be asked about her identity and role in the engagement. As she moved, Elena could hear police officers discovering the bodies of the battalion members she had eliminated. Elena's extraction was successful, but she knew that her involvement in the incident would eventually be discovered through forensic evidence and witness statements. Colonel Morrison would need to be contacted immediately to ensure that Elena's actions were properly explained and justified to the authorities. The alternative was spending the rest of her life as a fugitive from a system she had risked everything to protect. 3 days later, Elena met with Colonel Morrison in a secure government facility. The investigation into the Phantom Battalion conspiracy had revealed the full scope of the plot, including the identities of high-ranking military officers who had been involved in the cover-up. Elena's actions at the memorial had not only prevented a massacre, but had also provided the evidence needed to root out the corruption that had made the attack possible. Colonel Morrison informed Elena that she would be receiving official recognition for her heroism, though much of the story would remain classified to protect national security interests. The Phantom Battalion chapter was finally closed, but Elena knew that the experience had changed her forever. She had discovered that sometimes one person really could make a difference, even when facing impossible odds and overwhelming opposition. Elena adjusted the sights on her rifle one final time before placing it in the storage case that would return it to official custody. The weapon had served her well during the most challenging mission of her career, and she hoped it would never be needed for such desperate circumstances again. As Elena walked away from the facility, she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that hundreds of innocent lives had been saved by her courage and determination.